On Monday, the Russian Progress resupply ship performed a 5-minute burn, actually a little bit beyond that, in order to push the International Space Station out of harm's way. Ironically, danger that was created by Russia in the first place when they destroyed the Cosmos 1408 satellite with an anti-sat missile test. This particular test was both irresponsible and, frankly, unnecessary. Russia could have tested their anti-sat weapons out on a much smaller satellite with the same results, but instead they decided to destroy an old and very large satellite, producing a colossal amount of debris. And what you're looking at right now is the initial spread of the debris pattern that was created by the anti-sat test, and it's become much, much worse since then, spreading well into the orbital paths of virtually all of Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. And even though the Starlink satellites are designed with boosters and evasion programs in order to keep them out of harm's way, there is a certain percentage of these satellites which fail pretty much right at launch, about 3% of them. And those satellites are both unable to avoid collisions and also unable to deorbit themselves. And as a result, this problem continues to become more and more pressing as we send more and more satellites into orbit. But what the hell can we do about it? Well, on my channel, I've talked a lot about this, and I finally had an opportunity to speak to somebody who's heading up a very aggressive project to deal with space debris. It's one of the most generously funded plans for space debris mitigation in the world, and it's not being put forward by NASA or by the US Space Force. It's being put forward by the humble little UK Space Agency, and we're going to find out all about it in just a moment. Hey guys, so once again, back here at the UK Space Agency, again on extremely short notice. This is a fantastic opportunity here. We're going to be talking about space debris mitigation. So, Doctor, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself to the viewers?
Sure, yeah. My name's Adam Camilletti. I'm the Space Systems Lead in the Office of the Chief Engineer at UK Space Agency.
Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, Doctor. So, my viewers know a great deal about the crisis facing us with space debris and such, but of course, there's a great deal of debate also in terms of how bad is it really? I mean, space is big, very, very big, as they talk about in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so, do we still have a lot of room for error? Other people, however, say that the Kessler syndrome is already happening, as we speak. In your opinion, how bad is this situation, and how likely is a Kessler syndrome chain reaction to happen?
So, it is a serious concern. There's, I think, estimates are around 130 million pieces of space debris up there. And you range from, defunct satellites, fairly large things that we can track, to small things which are much, much harder to track. But they're moving at such incredible speeds, even the small things that you can't track can do a lot of damage, right? So you've got a whole range of different sizes, and those can be a threat. They do cause anomalies, and there have been collisions between defunct satellites, and those have created showers of debris. So it's not purely theoretical. These things have been seen to happen, and impacts have been, and anomalies have been observed, which people believe are due to impacts. So it is a serious concern. There are consequences already happening, and as I'm sure your viewers know, the number of launches and the number of satellites going up is increasing all the time. So the probability of collisions is going to go up, and those satellites are going to be at greater risk of impact. So it is something we need to take seriously and do something about.
So, since you mentioned the issue of so many satellites going up, that's actually very much in the news all the time. We just had a OneWeb launch. We have Starlink launches, it seems, every time you turn around. Of course, recent legislation was passed that, to compel deorbits in about 5 years for every satellite. However, that doesn't address the satellites that malfunction almost immediately after launch. There seems to be about 3% of Starlink satellites, is the estimate I heard, that actually malfunction and therefore cannot deorbit themselves. Regardless of how long theoretically we're supposed to take before we deorbit something, are there going to be a growing number of problems with satellites that malfunction and can't deorbit?
Well, I think you can look at it in different ways. Yes, if the reliability of the satellites that we produce at the moment doesn't change and doesn't improve, and you just launch more, then just multiplying those numbers together, the chance of failure and the number of satellites, you're just going to get more failed satellites. There are things you can do to mitigate against that. So you can deliver into a lower orbit first, so that if you're so-called dead on arrival, you'll passively deorbit very, very quickly. So you launch into a lower orbit and then you gradually orbit raise once you've done your checkouts, right? That's one way of mitigating it. Or, regulatory bodies, agencies that give the licenses to these satellites can mandate either high reliability or independent deorbit packages and things like that to make sure that we don't end up with a huge cloud of defunct satellites. Or they can mandate that if you want a license, you've got to get an ADR insurance policy to drag you down out of orbit. So we're in this interesting time where those options are being explored and agencies are discussing the best way that we can make space sustainable and we don't end up with this cloud of debris around the Earth.
If we keep going the way we're going now without properly dealing with the problem, how likely would you say that disaster is to happen? How long do we have? I mean, best guess. I'm not going to hold you to it, obviously, but let's guess. What do you think the odds are of us dodging a bullet or getting hit by one?
I think the chances of if we carry on the way we're going, the chances of an impact between either a defunct satellite and an operating satellite, or two defunct satellites, that's very likely to happen unless we do something about it. If that then cascades into a full-blown Kessler syndrome, where you essentially block low Earth orbit with debris, that's a much harder one to call. I think that's very, very difficult to say that that's definitively going to happen. But I think something has to be done now to prevent, a regular occurrence of satellites being wiped out by collisions with either defunct satellites or floating debris left over from missions, old rocket bodies or drop tools or nuts and bolts that have fallen off spacecraft.
Now, recently during the SLS, one of the aborted launch attempts, those comments were made in terms of there are many, many periods of time, maybe a couple of seconds apiece, where they can't launch because of potential debris collision or potential collision issues. How much worse has this problem gotten since the last time we went to the moon with Apollo? I mean, how much worse is it now?
No, I mean it's far worse. It's far worse. If you think of the what is that, 60 odd years, in that intervening time, the space industry's increased by many orders of magnitude. It's now no longer the preserve of governments and research organizations. There's commercial launches. It's no longer just as it was back in the space race and the Apollo era, really only America and the Soviet Union. You've got many other countries launching now. You've got commercial satellites. You've got CubeSats, and so it's vastly different. But along with that increase in launches, we've now got, by we I mean humankind, we've got much better technology for tracking that debris, both in space and on ground, and that's exactly why. For the SLS launch, they knew like we can't launch there, because we do track an enormous amount of debris and objects orbiting the Earth from the ground, and our ability to do that is improving all the time. So hand in hand with the problem getting worse, our ability to combat it, or at least know the scale of the problem, is increasing all the time.
So apart from collision avoidance, which obviously burns up fuel on these satellites, that sort of thing, what are the preferred methods that the UK Space Agency and ESA are looking at right now for debris mitigation? What are the best ways of getting that stuff out of there?
So the one of the major things that UKSA is doing, and one of the things that I'm heavily involved in at UKSA, is active debris removal, so-called ADR. So we've just announced £4 million worth of funding for 2 companies to do parallel, what we call Phase B studies in the UK. So that will enable them to develop mission concepts for active debris removal up to the preliminary design stage. And these are concepts where you launch a mission, and we've mandated that they've got to design a mission that goes after 2 UK registered but defunct satellites and deorbits them. But the Chaser spacecraft that does that deorbiting is also refurbishable. Okay, so it does 2, then it goes back up to a parking orbit, and it's ready to be refueled. So all being well, it can go after 2, 3, 4 more. So it's it's focus on sustainability, not just putting one satellite up there to remove another satellite. We really want to get bang for our buck, as it were. We want to launch one Chaser satellite and bring down multiple satellites. They've got to be defunct UK satellites, and another key thing is that they've got to be unprepared for deorbiting. So what I mean by that is that nowadays some satellites are launched with kind of grapple features and various functionality or design elements that enable them to be removed. But 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago, satellites weren't designed that way. So we've made it quite difficult for the companies we're funding. We said you've got to go after satellites that they're not going to help you. They're defunct. They can't maneuver, and they've got no grapple features. But you've still got to grab them and deorbit them.
Now, is Astroscale one of those companies that you've selected?
It's Astroscale and ClearSpace are the 2, and they're running in parallel. They've got different concepts. So we're in this phase now where we're relying on them to come up with concepts, trade off different options, convince us what one works best, show us that they've taken into account this need to be refurbishable, and also we've also got to be convinced that the mission isn't going to create more debris. That it would be ironic if you do an active debris removal mission and you create more debris. So it's got to not only convince us that it can go after these 2 or more satellites. We want to make sure that it's reliable and it's safe and it doesn't exacerbate the problem. So we'll be looking over what they do with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that's all looked after.
Have they presented any design concepts to you that you can share, or is that still proprietary?
The phase that we're going into now, obviously I can't really talk about because it's a competition, but this is the Phase B, and we did fund them for Phase 0 and Phase A, and we're very happy with what they did in those phases. Obviously, I can't go into detail because they're both competing against each other, but they both did a really tremendous job. And I think when those results do become public, I think everyone will be really excited by what they've done.
Now, heading out onto kind of an unconventional tangent for this, but nevertheless, I think still very relevant. I had an opportunity to talk to one of your neighbors here, MagDrive, not that long ago, in terms of next generation propulsion systems. Are you guys exploring that in terms of things that have much, much higher ISPs than the thrusters that are used for satellites these days to extend their lifespan, to extend the time period that they can do debris avoidance? Is that anything you're looking at right now?
Well, I mean, the UKSA funds those sort of developments in the early phase. So in that sense, we are, because UKSA is kind of across the piece. We're always looking to support UK industry in developing novel technologies, whether it's a technology that's going to support ADR or something else. In terms of ADR, it's really going to be up to Astroscale and ClearSpace. If they're going to present their designs to us, if they can convince us that using a novel technology, which comes with it has an associated risk with it because it's not a proven technology. It may take some more funding. It may take longer to develop. But if they can convince us that there's a benefit, like you say, it's got higher performance, or it's more efficient, or it can extend the life, then we'll ask them to do a trade-off to convince us, right, that's the right way to go. But that's what this phase B will. It's those sort of questions that these phase B studies will answer.
Now, in terms of previous concepts that have already been presented, and like I say, I'm not even sure if this is relevant to our current conversation now that you're looking at other options, but, Surrey Satellite sent up a package of things to ISS, and that, my favorite was the Harpoon, call me Ishmael, that sort of thing. So were any of those concepts, do you personally find any of them compelling or interesting, or do you think we need something other than nets and harpoons and things?
No, I mean there's a variety of options that are being considered for ADR. I don't want to tell you which one because
right.
But things like nets, harpoons, variations on robot arms are the typical ones that teams look into when they're thinking about ADR, and they've got and there's variations on them. Do you just have one robot arm? Do you have two? Do you have a net with a tether that's on the chase, or is it a net with then a drag sail or something like that, or like a harpoon with a tether, or it could be a harpoon that then deploys a drag sail? So all of these things are in the mix and have to be traded off. And so some of them, if they've been proven in flight, that might be quite appealing because they're a more mature technology. But they may have downsides because something like a net that is just left and not tethered, if it doesn't hit its target, have you just then created another piece of space debris? So all these things have to be traded off, by Astroscale, by ClearSpace, and they have to then present to us, why they think the option that they've scored the highest is the best one to go for. And we'll be reviewing that over the next sort of 12 to 15 months. And concluding on what we think is the best one to take forward.
So, getting close to the end here, obviously the big thing that comes up, no matter what program you're talking about with space, is the issue of funding. Obviously, you're saying £4 million has been invested in this by the UK Space Agency. I've also heard that ESA in general is also funding this. That actually kind of sets, Europe apart from the rest of the world in terms of aggressively investing in a solution. First of all, could you comment, please, on why do you think Europe is particularly focused on this issue?
So I think there's a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think is we take space sustainability really seriously, and we want to be leading the world in that, both technically in terms of having companies like Astroscale and ClearSpace in the UK developing the technology, but also in terms of regulation and policy. So we want to make sure that if we're licensing spacecraft, we make sure that they're behaving in a sustainable way and that they've considered, deorbiting the spacecraft or making it safe at the end of life. We want to be a responsible space actor. There's other reasons as well. I mean, the technology that is being developed for ADR is also useful for things like in-orbit servicing. So, robot arms and things like that. If you've got a satellite up there that is perfectly functional but needs a boost or needs refueling, then having the technology to do that, like robot arms, refueling, a lot of that comes from the ADR development. So we're playing the sort of longer game here as well. So those are some of the reasons why UKSA is doing it. And I think for ESA as well, they're doing their ClearSpace 1 mission. So there's a rocket body up there, final stage, VESPA stage, I think it's called, from one of the Vega rockets. And they're funding a ClearSpace mission to bring that down because, again, they want to be seen as a sustainable and responsible actor in space. And it's basically in all of our interests. If you leave clouds of debris up there, you're increasing the risk for your future missions. So right. You really want to tidy your own patch up and encourage others to do the same. Otherwise, you don't know whether your next mission is going to be, destroyed or severely damaged by space debris. And it's not just missions around in LEO, low Earth orbit. missions have to transition through that low Earth orbit.
Right.
So if you end up with a terrible debris environment there, you're closing the door on a whole raft of space missions.
Exactly.
So it's really that we're thinking about, and it's really learning the lessons of, where people have not acted that well on Earth, and now we have problems because we didn't care about the environment in the past. We need to learn those lessons as we go forward into space and make sure we don't then realize too late that we've made a mess of things.
We humans seem to do that a great deal. Your answer actually just made me think of one other question. I had an opportunity to interview your colleague, Dr. Maheshwarappa, about space solar.
Yeah.
And the question was asked to me, and I forgot to ask her, what do you do about space debris? What do you do about micrometeoroids, et cetera? But you just brought up the fact that these satellites might have a dual purpose, not only removing space debris, but also servicing existing satellites. So would you say that this solution, if we're going to get, power, a lot of power being generated in space, could this also protect and repair those satellites should they encounter those problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to predict the future. I don't imagine that an ADR mission will be a dual use in an ADR and refueler. I think it would be more likely that the technology that is developed for ADR will be then redeployed on other satellites for servicing. So we touched on this a little bit earlier. If you've got an ADR mission and it's going after a tumbling satellite that it wants to deorbit, then you need very good guidance, navigation and control, very good attitude and orbital control systems on that satellite. You need robot arms to grab the client you're going after. Now, those are all technologies that are really, really useful for in-orbit servicing. So I see that there'll be technologies developed for ADR, and they'll then become sort of almost like off-the-shelf components for future servicing missions, and that would play a part in space-based solar power, definitely.
Fantastic, thank you. And then I guess my last question, again, going back towards the funding side of things. Obviously, you guys are investing, funds in the millions, but nevertheless, it would seem that a comprehensive solution to this is probably going to be in the billions long run. So, I mean, and all of this, at least in my opinion, can't come from government. So, how do we get people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, who obviously their future well-being from Kuiper and Starlink depends on LEO being safe. How do we get them involved and to invest in this solution?
So it's a really, really good question. I don't think there's a simple answer. I think there's multiple ways to get them involved. So obviously working collaboratively with them when the opportunity arises. There's also the regulation piece as well. If licensing authorities all around the world work together to ensure that part of their their licensing agreement makes sure that companies take debris removal seriously, either by, as I said earlier, taking out a policy for an ADR mission if their satellites don't work, or having deorbit packages on board that are independent from the main spacecraft. So if something goes wrong, they automatically deorbit, launching into lower orbits, doing the checkouts there so you don't end up dead on arrival. All those sort of things can be sort of put in as terms in the licensing agreement to encourage operators that way. The difficulty is that you really need everybody to move together on that. Otherwise, people just go to the regime that has the less stringent rules, right? So that's not an easy thing to do. But even those companies already are looking into designing, their ConOps, their concept of operations, to have debris removal in mind. So like I said, launching into a lower orbit first of all, having beacons on them sometimes so that if they are defunct, everybody knows where they are. And lots of people think that actually those big satellites, well, not big satellites, but the satellites that are defunct or are not working, they're perhaps not so much of a problem because you know where they are, right? Not everybody's convinced about that, because if you know where they are and you're an operating satellite, you can move out the way. But what happens when you've got two defunct satellites and neither of them can move? Then they can collide, and that's why you need ADR. So I think it's going to be a combination of things. It's going to be better practices, better mission planning and ConOps. It's going to be ADR, and it's going to be better sort of regulatory enforcement and licensing.
Well, I really appreciate you spending your time with us today, Doctor. Thank you very much in talking about this extremely important issue. And also, may I say, it is very nice to see that there is a nation and there is a National Space Agency that is focusing, and not a very well-funded one, by the way, that's focusing on this particular issue. So definitely appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Jeff and Elon, once the UK Space Agency proves that there is a practical way to deal with this problem, are you going to invest in it? Because your future plans in space, and indeed the economic well-being of the planet, depends on the health of low Earth orbit, and all of that could be destroyed by a Kessler syndrome caused by an out-of-control space debris issue. The ball's in your court, guys. Do something about it, and until they do, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.